section of Aristotle, but they were not materialists. This is important to note. Then you have Galen. You'll see why this is important. Galen is 2nd century A.D., 129 to 200 A.D. there. He's important because he is the medical figure par excellence for the next 1800 years, give or take. I mean, Galen is the man. In fact, there's a lot we could learn from Galen today. For instance, he said the first thing you have to do is study the patient. Then you see what you can do by changing behavior. That's the step one for curing, is to change the behavior of the patient. What they eat, how they sleep, what their exercise regime is. Are they getting enough fresh air? Are they getting sunshine? The second thing you do is, if the first does not work, then you can prescribe a treatment. But the less treatment, the better. And prescribing a treatment is always seen as a failure of understanding. Sometimes necessary, but definitely means that we failed to understand something correctly. And the last thing you do is any sort of invasive procedure. That is only in the last instance when everything else has failed to give results. I mean, there's a lot to learn in Galen, let me put it that way. Even many years later, Galen can teach us. And then, of course, in 570 to 632, you get Muhammad and the rise of Islam. And one of the most extraordinary events in the history of the world, without doubt, is that in the nether regions of barren Arabia, a prophet is born. And it could not be more poor or more remote in that district. And he begins preaching some, new ideas. And if it's 600 AD, you walked over and said, you know what, there's this guy out in that desert over there, and they're going to conquer basically all of the known world here in about 70 years. People would have laughed at you. They were poor, relatively backwards. No one would consider them civilized. They barely had writing. They had writing, but not a lot of it. Most people had never heard of them. And then in basically 150 years, they conquered all of the dominions that used to be the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, the Persian Empire. I mean, just a huge swath, including, importantly for our lecture, the Iberian Peninsula of Spain. 750, they pretty much complete the conquest there. Now, scholars have often argued and still argue about how that could happen. I don't know the answer to that, but it's just one of these amazing events that in a very short period of time, civilization after civilization, massive, huge landmass is conquered by what had previously been an unknown, and certainly from a material standpoint or a civilization standpoint, unspectacular group. But the power of Muhammad and Islam. 750 is where the philosophical story really picks up, because this is when the Abbasids defeat the Umayyads. Umayyads are the first caliphate who really organized the Islamic Empire. But they are overthrown by the Abbasids, who move the center of power to Baghdad. Originally not Baghdad, but they end up in Baghdad very quickly. And they actually build Baghdad, by the way. They didn't move to an existing city. They said, let's build a city here and make it our capital. And that's where Baghdad comes from. Although, of course, civilization had been in that region for time immemorial. But they founded Baghdad, built Baghdad, and that's, the historical arrival of that as a chief city and civilization is the Abbasid Caliphate. And that takes place in 750, and then it goes to 1250, which is a pretty good run, 500 years. And almost immediately, and no one is really clear why, they think, let's translate all the Greek works. Let's translate them all. Let's go. Let's do it. And so they start what's called the translation movement. And they spend it's truly vast sums of money to translate all of the major mathematical, engineering, philosophical, medical works that they could get their hands on from Greek into Arabic. If that had not happened, almost certainly much of the Greek texts and that we have today would have been lost, or they would have been a much longer time resurfacing. because some of them, well, not some of them, many of them only exist now in the Arabic translations. That's how they were passed along through the generations. So for hundreds of years, it was the Arabic scholars who was keeping the Greek tradition alive. To give you an idea of how immense an undertaking this was, the estimates are that, or the estimates have the records of it, but it's hard to translate. But a good translator would make about $20,000 to $30,000 a month in roughly equivalent of modern money. So you're talking something on the $200,000 to $300,000 a year, and it took a team of translators to work on each text. Often they were groups, and so you would have 5 or 6 translators working on a single text. So you're looking at $1 million to $2 million of investment to get one of these texts delivered in Arabic. And this project went on for almost 2 centuries. It wasn't a flash in the pan that said, "Oh, let's do this." It was an ongoing and really intellectually intense undertaking, because many of them the Arabs didn't have ancient Greek. So they had to go out and get scholars who still had the Greek. And this wasn't coming from the Byzantine world, by the way, because the Arabs and the Byzantines did not get along. But many Christian scholars were still around, particularly in Syria. So a lot of the works got translated from ancient Greek into Syriac, and then from Syriac into Arabic, because Arabic and Syriac, a lot of Arabs spoke Syriac, but, so making all these bridges. But this was a huge, if they did nothing else, the Abbasid Caliphate would be famous for the fact that they had invested this huge intellectual resource and money and time into bringing all the classics, or many of the classics, into Arabic and keeping those texts alive. So what happens, of course, as they do this, is the translators themselves, and then philosophers associated with the translation, begin to be influenced by the ideas that come from the Greeks. For whatever reason, the Greeks always seem to influence people. Wherever they go, these texts seem to be hugely influential. And so the early ones are Al-Farabi and Avicenna are 2 of the most famous associated with this movement, and we'll hear about them. But then I want to get to our first philosopher tonight is Al-Ghazali. It's hard to narrow down. Al-Ghazali wrote everything and did everything. I think that's the quick summary of it. He was a legal theorist, one of the most important Sunni legal theorists in Islamic history, still quoted and taught in schools in the Sunni world today. He was a significant thinker on everything philosophical. He was one of the most influential Sufi thinkers, and certainly played a major, if not the most important role in giving the philosophical foundations for Sufism in the Islamic world. He's certainly one, if not the most important philosopher on that front.
We just watching some lectures,
for instance,
on YouTube.
If you listen to music from this part of the world, there are bands called Ghazali, and this kind of thing. He's constantly referenced because he was sort of the Sufi poet.
The VC glitch is getting knowledge, man.
But he was famous.
Giving y'all some
He
philosophy.
was the principal intellectual, the sort of the head thinker in Baghdad, at the leading institution in Baghdad. So he was roughly the most important, most influential thinker in the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate in his lifetime. And what's important is that he had sort of a long, dark night of the soul, and he left. He said, "I'm leaving. This is wrong." And he went on a tour. He did some monastic living. He went to Mecca. And when he came back, he wrote a whole series of new works. So I want to look at both sides of him. To understand this philosophical tradition, we need to see both sides. Originally, we don't have time to quote everything, but originally one of the works that's representative of him, we quote from here, is called The Incoherence of the Philosophers. And what's happened is Al-Ghazali began to suspect that all of these Greek thinkers were beginning to mislead Islamic theologians and philosophers, and so he decided to assault the philosophers themselves. There's a great quote here that will give you the tenor of this. The first quote on the first page there. "The sources of their unbeliefs, their unbelief, being the misled Islamic thinkers, philosophers, is in their hearing high-sounding names such as Socrates, Hippocrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and their likes, and the exaggeration and misguidedness of groups of their followers in describing their minds, the excellence of their principles, the exactitude of their geometrical, logical, natural, and metaphysical sciences. So, this is what's strange. This is an Islamic thinker 1,400 years after the death of Aristotle, feeling it's necessary to attack him. Right? And he's really here busy going after Avicenna and to a lesser degree Al-Farabi, but his real target is Avicenna.
What up, Jay Hollywood? Keep grinding, my
The
nigga.
incoherence of philosophers is famous because it is an unbelievably efficient and logical demolition of this whole series of philosophical positions and arguments that had been made by the Aristotelians, by Avicenna, and by several other groups, some of the Neoplatonists and so on. But what's strange about it is, on one hand, he so demolished them that he sort of undermined the credibility of these people for a while, of the sort of Greek influence. But on the other hand, he did two things. One, he's so clear and concise and did such a good job of presenting the other side's arguments that people sort of used his work as an introduction to the philosophers he was attacking, right? That's how concise and what a clear mind he had, that he could give a convincing argument for the side that he was about to demolish, but you would be like, wow, that's a really fair and interesting introduction. I want to read more of that person. And then, of course, he would eviscerate it. But the other thing he did, and this is where the influence of Aristotle in particular is important, is he's using the rules of Aristotelian logic much, if not all of the time. And so the degree to which already Aristotle has impregnated the tradition is immense, because he's using, in fact, the methods that he learned reading Aristotle and Aristotle's books on arguments and rhetoric and logic to attack the philosophers who are trying to promote Aristotelianism in various guises. But it is a purely negative work. And people noticed this at the time, that this was a purely negative work. That he said, oh, that's wrong, and 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 this is wrong. But he never got around to saying, well, what's right? And this seems to be what was at the crux of his sort of intellectual depression or panic or terror. And as he describes it, and I'll read this section here from The Alchemy of Happiness, it's not a lack of faith.
You're the best
I don't think this would ever occur to him.
You're the best man.
What he lost faith in was reason. What he realized is he couldn't demonstrate what he wanted to demonstrate. He couldn't make the arguments he wanted to argue with reason, essentially. Logic, he could defeat everybody else's, but it's pretty clear that he could defeat his own as well. And that he reached the pinnacle of his thinking. I mean, he really was the number one guy. But he couldn't demonstrate what he wanted to purely with rational tools that he had been given and learned and mastered, the likes of Aristotle. And so here's a quote. This is, again, a bit of a longer quote from The Alchemy of Happiness. The laws of phenomena must be constant, or there could be no such thing as science, but it is a great error to mistake the slave for the master. As long as this difference in the perceptive faculty of observers exists, disputes must necessarily go on. And then he has the blind man and the elephant metaphor, about how, you put blind men with an elephant, somebody says it's got a skinny snake, and somebody it's a big tree trunk, somebody, you get all these different ones. For instance, if a man ceases to take any interest in worldly matter, conceives a distaste for common pleasure, and appears sunk in depression, the doctor will say, this is a case of melancholy, and requires such and such a prescription. The physicist will say, this is a dryness of the brain caused by hot weather and cannot be relieved till the air becomes moist. He is astrologer will attribute to some particular conjunction or opposition of planets. Thus far their wisdom reaches, says the Quran. It does not occur to them that what has really happened is this, that the Almighty has a concern for the welfare of that man and has therefore commanded his servants, the planets, the elements, to produce such a condition in him that he may turn away from the world to his Maker. The knowledge of this fact is a lustrous pearl from the ocean of inspirational knowledge, to which all other forms of knowledge are as islands in the sea. When he returns from his tour, from his soul searching, this is what he comes back with, the Sufi tradition. It is not through logic or reason or rationality that one reaches Allah. Because he's greater than the human mind can comprehend. We can't do that. It is through inspiration. And inspiration, he means particularly, by the way, to be the direct contact with your Maker, with Allah. There's no intervention. That is the goal of your pursuit. That is where real knowledge comes from. By the way, this is not far off from what Socrates talks about, because Socrates is continually talking about the fact that he's inspired directly, and he seems to be serious about this. He's not. Sometimes he is joking around, but many times he is clearly quite serious. That you strive for this. And so then you can get a further elaboration on this in the Confessions. But notice this is a complete break with what he had been doing up to this time. Logic, reason, Aristotelianism. Using those arguments to defend the faith, using those arguments to elaborate the faith, and create this general bed of knowledge. And like I said, he was the man. And then he goes back, has his break, which nobody understood, of course, because he left, essentially the best job you could get, and said, no, I'm going out in the desert. I'm going to think, I'm going to ponder, I'm going to tour, I'm going to wander. And this is what he came back with. And so this is sort of a summary of that from his... The title is translated as Confessions. This isn't that kind of work, by the way. I don't know. I think people just like to translate it that way because it reminds me of our own version of the Confessions. But anyway, I don't think it's a good translation. I don't have Arabic, but I'm suspicious of that translation. We may say the same of inspiration, which is one of the branches of intuitional knowledge. Further, the perception of things which are beyond the attainment of reason is only one of the features peculiar to inspiration, which possesses a great number of others. The characteristic which we mentioned is only, as it were, a drop of water in the ocean, and we have mentioned it because people experience what is analogous to it in dreams and in the sciences of medicine and astronomy. These branches of knowledge belong to the domain of prophetic miracles, and reason cannot attain to them. As to the other characteristics of inspiration, they are only revealed to adepts in Sufism and in a state of ecstatic transport. The little that we know of the nature of inspiration we owe to the kind of likeness to which we find in sleep. Without that, we would be incapable of comprehending it, and consequently of believing in it, for conviction results from comprehension. The process of initiation into Sufism exhibits this likeness to inspiration from the first. There is in it a kind of ecstasy proportioned to the condition of the person initiated, and a degree of certitude and conviction which cannot be attained by reason. The single fact is sufficient to make us believe in inspiration. By the way, this precise line of argument was central to, if you know Ernst Cassirer, one of the great German Kantian philosophers of the 20th century. This is, I think he's just quoting Al-Ghazali all over the place. But he makes precisely this argument. You can't know things, there's things you can't know with reason, hence you have to rely on inspiration. Kant comes very close to making precise, you can pretty much say Kant says very similar things. Right? This is a significant jump. And one of the things that we get wrong when we think about things and we say, oh, that's unreasonable or irrational. It may be true, but this is only an insult or a criticism if someone is striving for reason and rationality. This is one of the problems that we have with something like Sharia law, by the way, a word which is always abused in the media. Sharia law just means an attempt to think out how one should live one's life. This is what Sharia law is. And it is the central corpus of the Islamic tradition, because you have the Quran, and then you take guidance from the Quran and from inspiration. And you work from that. What should I have for breakfast? Quite literally. I mean, he wrote a 40-part work. Al-Ghazali wrote a famous 40-part work that just takes you through your day, essentially, and in very small details and very large details. How do you live well? How do you live a life that's going to gain you a reward in heaven, is essentially the argument. And you work backwards, not from rationality, but from the inspiration of the Prophet and the Quran. Period. Those are your sources. Inspiration of the Prophet, inspiration of the Quran. And so if anybody has looked at Sharia jurisprudence, or has looked at the Quran for that matter, it's not organized in the way that we would like to organize it. You know, there's not a clean index. It's not organized thematically. It's not organized by numerical codes. It tends to be organized by analogical argument and by sort of various other traditions that will throw us off. But don't take my word for it. Go take a read of it. You're like, wow, how is this organized? But it is absolutely crucial and central to the Islamic tradition. I'll give you one example. I should have checked, but I think Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, who was an Iranian and Iraqi cleric. He's right there. I think he was in Iraq or Iran. I think he's in Iraq. He's an Iraqi cleric. Has a website, or had a website up for the longest time, and you could just ask any question. And they had them all up there. And you would say, you know, my wife wants to buy a dog and I don't want a dog in the house. What is the right thing to do? And they'll answer right away. They give you back, say, hey, no, this is what's totally forbidden. This is what's mandated for you to do. Here's what's not totally forbidden, but really you shouldn't do it all. This is what's questionable. This is what's okay. And this is what's fine, but is not mandated. And so they'll give you this and say, you know, you can't, maybe you could, you probably shouldn't, definitely shouldn't, or man, you do that and you go to hell. Or if you do that, you're earning points in heaven, right? And it's very helpful kinds of guidance. And so we think of Sharia as this horrible imposition, but it really is this living philosophical discourse about how one should live one's life within the context of an Islamic world. And that corpus has been building and growing for, 1,300 years. It's a huge, vast intellectual undertaking. But Al-Ghazali was one of the key figures in making this argument that, look, you cannot demonstrate all the things we want to demonstrate with reason. You must rely on inspiration. Because this is Muhammad, this is the Quran, this is direct experience with God. Now, we move to Averroes. By the way, there's a couple of disputes about how you pronounce his name. By the way, I should mention their actual names. I haven't said this. Al-Ghazali's actual name is Abu Hamid Muhammad ibn Muhammad al-Ghazali. And believe it or not, Averroes' original name is Abu al-Wahid Muhammad ibn Rust, which somehow became Averroes. But it turns out they translated Ahmad ibn Rust into Hebrew, and then Hebrew into Latin, and then Latin into English, and we got Averroes. So, there you go. The history is funny. Now, Averroes was born in Al-Andalusia, the Spanish-occupied, Islamic Spain. And he was the Aristotelian. He was the man. So much so that St. Thomas Aquinas referred to him as the commentator. No one ever they didn't call him his name, because he was just the commentator. He is in the famous painting by Raphael of the School of Athens. There he is. He's there because he is the man who did Aristotle. He translated and improved the translations in Arabic, which were then translated into Latin at the time of his life and just shortly thereafter. But he also made 3 commentaries on the Aristotle. One was very short. It was sort of executive summary, Aristotle for those who are quite busy. Second one was sort of a fuller edition of that, a little longer, a little more involved. And the third one was basically facing pages. A page of Aristotle, a page of Averroes. So extensive and spectacular was his commentary that early works of Aristotle in Latin tended to have also the complete commentary of Averroes. So when you learned Aristotle, you would actually learn it through his interpretation, because it's tricky, and he explained it very clearly. I mean, this, even at a couple hundred, well, whatever we are, 900 years later, you think, wow, that's pretty concise. I mean, he's a good writer. He's a nice explainer. You can argue with things, but wow, that's clear, that's concise, that's hit the high points. That's good work right there. He was a quality workman. What's significant about him, though, well, many things are significant. He was also a jurist, but he was really, really a strong Aristotelian. And he attacked Al-Ghazali in person. Well, not in person, attacked Al-Ghazali's work. And he wrote a work called The Incoherence of the Incoherence, which is, of course, a response to the incoherence of the philosophers. Now, the incoherence of the incoherence contains, it must be 90%. I think it's all, but it doesn't have every single sentence of the incoherence of the philosophers. It has almost every sentence. And so you get a paragraph from Al-Ghazali, and then you get generally a longer paragraph from Averroes going, that is incorrect. But he also takes time to correct Avicenna and Al-Farabi, two other Arabic philosophers who Al-Ghazali is attacking, to say, no, Al-Ghazali is right here because Avicenna and Al-Farabi, or one or either of them, are incorrect. They've got a wrong Aristotelian text. They don't understand Aristotle, and the debate rolls on. But what was key for our purposes in understanding this is, in doing that, he's skating on the heterodox line, right? This is tricky. This is dangerous. And what's been happening in Islamic Spain is there's been a fragmentation of the power centers. In fact, this is happening all over the Islamic world at this point. And so he was able to have one court that supported him, but tricky, because there's always, court intrigue and all that. But also there was this growing tide of resistance to this sort of heterodox thinking or free thinking or philosophical attempts to leave the generally accepted bounds of Quranic thought, because increasingly Islam was felt to be under threat, and correctly so, because more Spain is being reconquered, and you're about to have the Mongols come over and take Baghdad in not too long. So things are being challenged. So his argument, though, which we can read here, sort of a long one, but it will give you a sense of where he disagrees with Al-Ghazali and then what the stakes are. This is the last one there. We maintain that the business of philosophy is nothing other than to look into creation and to ponder over it in order to guide it to the Creator. In other words, to look into the meaning of existence. For knowledge of creation leads to the cognizance of the Creator through knowledge of the created. The more perfect becomes the knowledge of the creation, the more perfect becomes the knowledge of the Creator. The law encourages and exhorts us to observe creation. Thus, it is clear that it is to be taken either as a religious injunction or something approved by the law. By the way, that's a very specific legal term in Sharia. If an injunction means you have to do it, approved means it's really good if you do it. Thus is it clear that it is to be taken either as religious injunction or something approved by the law. But the law urges us to observe creation by means of reason and demands the knowledge thereof through reason. Now, it being established that the law makes the observation and consideration of creation by reason obligatory, and consideration is nothing but to make explicit the implicit, this can only be done through reason. Thus we must look into creation with reason. Moreover, it is obvious that the observance of the law proves and encourages must be of the most perfect type, performed with the most perfect kind of reasoning. As the law emphasizes knowledge of God and His creation by inference, it is incumbent on any who wishes to know God and His whole creation by inference to learn the kind of inference, their conditions, and that which distinguishes philosophy from dialectic and exhortation from syllogism. This is impossible unless one possesses knowledge beforehand of the various kinds of reasoning and learns to distinguish between reasoning and what is not reasoning. This cannot be done except one knows different parts, that is, the different kinds of premises. Averroes and the harmony of religion and philosophy. This is all but to say the only way to know God is through Aristotle. That is a summary of what he just said. Because Aristotle laid down the rules of reason.
The glitch is to listen to philosophy while playing 2K. Because when you listen to philosophy, not only will you not recognize that the VC is going into your pockets, but you will have wisdom going into your mind. So the glitch is twofold, for you will get money and you will get wisdom. Have a blessed day.
This is what he did. This is the influence he had. What is a syllogism? How do you know the principles? How do you divide an argument? How do you use rhetoric? When do you have false rhetoric? When have you got correct evidence? When can you make a true inference? I mean, the logic, Aristotle went on at incredible length, I assure you. Feel free to read through it. There's a lot of it, and it is incredibly powerful. It was a huge leap forward in sort of systematization of the knowledge of how to make correct and incorrect arguments. It's not perfect, and it's been expanded and since then, but this is what Averroes is saying right here. He's saying, you want to know God? There's only one way. It's a religious injunction to know God through reason, and you need to know reason. You need to know inference and syllogism, which is to say you have to know Aristotle, and you have to get it correct. Now, this is a direct contradiction to what Al-Ghazali has said. This is laying down the foundation of the arguments. And one way to understand, the difference that's about to take place in history, philosophical history, and cultural history, is what happens with these two arguments. Averroes' argument carries essentially no weight in the Islamic world. It's about to be overrun, and the kind of sort of philosophical speculation and free thinking and importation of foreign thought, it just doesn't hold up very well. And Al-Ghazali and his group win the day. They are more or less victorious. Averroes' arguments are translated into Latin, and in Latin they become one of the signal influences on the Renaissance. This is where it comes from. In fact, it's not just that the Islamic Church didn't like this argument, and we'll talk about why that would be, but I think about 4 or 5 years before the theses are nailed to the wall, and the Pope is facing problems. These problems had been growing, and so they have the big papal conclave. And out of the papal conclave, the big thing they produce is an indictment against Averroes' philosophy. 300 years later, what's the big threat to Catholicism? Averroes' philosophy. So that this was potentially a threat was recognized at the time. He himself sort of had to lay low for a while, and then when his supporter moved, he moved with him because he was in trouble. He was under threat. But it does not win the day in the Islamic world. In fact, it definitely loses the day. But in the Western world, because of the Reformation and the Renaissance, it carries the day. Why is Aristotelianism so significant and such an underpinning in Renaissance thinking, particularly in the higher subjects? In large part, not entirely, but in large part because of Averroes. His translations, his commentary are what influenced people like St. Thomas Aquinas. In fact, Aquinas is so influenced by him, he actually in his own work says, "Oh, look, this is mine. I created this. This is real Aquinas right here. I didn't steal this from Averroes. This is mine." Because a lot of it is just Averroes, just sort of modestly changed. And it's important to remember what St. Thomas Aquinas was trying to do. He was trying to meld Aristotelianism with Catholicism. This turns out not to work so well in the long run. Worked for a while, long run, not a good project. Same thing. It would be wrong to think of Averroes as anything but a devout and practicing Muslim. But he was trying to do the same thing that St. Thomas Aquinas was trying to do, which was to meld Aristotelianism with Islam. Now, this project doesn't really get off the ground because it sort of fails before it starts. But in attempting to do that, he influenced the Western mind, and he introduced a couple of ideas. And that's why I wanted to finish on that quote, to give you the distinct flavor difference. And I think a lot of this is tone and flavor that you get between someone like an Al-Ghazali and someone like an Averroes, and then what grows from that. One key point, and this is not an argument that Averroes would make, but it's implicit in his argument, is let's say you have this glass here, well, not a glass, have this little bit of water here. Why does it not float off into space? We would say gravity. Right? Well, what causes gravity? We would give you a scientific explanation. Where do those laws come from? Now, Averroes would say Allah created the universe, and he created the laws of the universe. And the laws of the universe suck that to the table, and then it cannot float off. Al-Ghazali says, no, this cannot be. This is a simplification, but he says this cannot be. Because that would mean God is limited to the laws that he's made. And God cannot be limited by anything. The only reason this sticks to the table is that every instance Allah intervenes because Allah wants it on the table. And if at any moment he did not wish it to be on the table, it would float up or disappear or turn into a cat. Right? There is no limit. You cannot place a limit on what God can do. And any attempt to do so is blasphemy, essentially. It's a blasphemous charge. What this means is the world is not fundamentally reasonable. That's why Al-Ghazali comes around to the point that you cannot approach God in the world through reason because it's not a reasonable world. God can make reasonable laws, but then he can violate them willy-nilly. For Averroes, this is not the case. God makes reasonable laws so that we can study the laws to understand him. It's sort of a gift. But you can see this is the seeds of deism. Right? It doesn't take a huge stretch of the imagination to go, well, if God created the laws, then we just study the laws and we don't have to worry about God so much, right? This is sort of French Enlightenment and the day, it's that sort of slope. And Al-Ghazali was not wrong about that. I mean, Al-Ghazali saw this and said, that path leads to, a bad place, a place we do not want to go. And again, Averroes was not a materialist, and he was not a free-thinking, libertine or atheist in any way. He was a good, earnest, devout Muslim. But it's clear in his philosophy that he thought reason should win the day. Reason was the path to understanding. And more or less, this is the dividing line we live in culturally as civilizations. I mean, this is an argument that hasn't finished. We're not done with this argument, by the way. But how do you discover things? How do you know? How do you gain knowledge? How do you understand the world? Right? Our argument is, through reason and evidence. Well, once you say that, faith becomes a bit tricky. Right? If you want reason and evidence, sort of the opposite of faith, and now we're in trouble. If you do not require that, you say, no, rationality has no place. You can use logic to argue once you have your principles, but first principles do not come from rationalism. You can't reason them out.
What the glitch?
You can experience them or you can accept them, but you can't reason them. Basically, it's an entirely different philosophical world. And if we fast forward today, one of the difficulties we often have communicating across the two civilizations is right along that flaw. I don't know if anybody heard that one of the religious authorities in Saudi Arabia thought that chess might be a bad idea. And this makes us laugh. We think, well, that's hilarious. How could chess be a bad idea? Well, one, notice that regulating the behavior of its citizens is what governments do. The fact that they would choose chess is no different from us saying, you can't drink alcohol till you're 21. But we say, alcohol, no, that's a serious thing, and chess is not. Well, that's a cultural, it's clearly just a cultural identification. Their argument is, look, you're not supposed to be wasting your time on silly pursuits. If you have free time, it should be dedicated to the contemplation or works of your God, and chess is certainly not that. Which is not an unreasonable argument within that context. But for us, that just seems silly, because what logically reasonable principle, what harm does it do for people to play chess?
So you're gonna explain it.
Well,
What up, JB? What up, JB? So here go the glitch, man. Here go the glitch. So basically, all you gotta do is play My Career, right? And then you just gotta listen to philosophy at the same time. You'll get money in your pocket, you'll get your badges, and you'll gain wisdom at the same time. You feel me? So that's what I'm doing, man. I'm just listening to some philosophical lectures on SoundCloud.com while playing 2K, getting my badges, getting my VC. It's actually the life glitch. This ain't even a bad VC glitch. This the glitch for life. You feel me? It's how you should be living, you feel me? To get your knowledge up, boy. Back to philosophical discussions.
Emoji happy tears. Emoji happy tears.
It's difficult for us to feel it. Because the cleric is making his argument, one, from the Quranic tradition, and two, from inspiration. I contemplated, I reflected about it, I prayed about it, and this is what I felt. And so here I go. And here's some quotes from the Quran, by the way, always quotes from the Quran, to support this. And that is the sort of world, whereas what we would have to do is we would have to have some studies. We'd have to have studies that show that kids who play chess are 4 times more likely to drop out of school and commit crimes and steal your cars. And if that were true, then we would have a movement to ban chess or to limit its exposure or to make sure you only play chess 60 minutes a day or whatever it was. But we would want evidence. And what we counted as evidence would not be anything like what the Islamic world counts as evidence. And so this is one of the things that we struggle with. We say, what's your argument? This. Well, what's your evidence? And what they often, within this tradition, provide as evidence, we simply, we just don't buy it. We don't believe it. Well, one, they use the Quran every time, and we don't accept that as evidence. We don't allow ourselves, generally speaking, to use the Bible as evidence for everything. We would like something with more studies and scientific. It's still hugely influential. But we've been working away from that premise for several hundred years. And so that is just this huge dividing line. And that dividing line goes back not 100 years, but goes back 1,000 years, basically. Because, again, what happens immediately after the life of Averroes, is the Mongols, I forget which Khan it is, Mulaga Khan, I think, one of the many friendly Khans, conquers Baghdad, and that sort of upsets everything. And the center of the Muslim world shifts from the Abbasid Caliphate to Egypt. And then a whole new series of power struggles ensue. Ottoman Turkish Empire is rolling along here pretty soon. But, it is definitely an end of that tradition. And so we have, again, the influence here is immense in both worlds. It's pretty clear that without the arrival of Aristotle, from the Arabic tradition, and many other works, by the way. It wasn't just Aristotle. I'm just focusing on Aristotle because he's the clearest centerpiece. They took the math, Euclid, Pythagoras, science, the medicine, Galen, just all the engineering works from the Romans. I mean, just much of it. You wouldn't have a Renaissance. I mean, everybody says, oh, the Renaissance. Oh, it's the rediscovery of the classic world, sort of a version of the classic world. Where did they rediscover it?
Like and subscribe to the Nigga Young
Right? It was in Arabic. And it was because of the conquest of Spain. So that's where they discovered. They didn't find it in Greece, because they weren't in Greece. They found it right there, conveniently located in the middle of Europe. That's the concept. And so it would not have gotten this kickstart. Those texts wouldn't have been there to rediscover without this incredible translation movement. And within the Arab world, the other thing that happens from this is you also get, algebra, by the way, comes from an Arabic word, right? It's the advancement in optics. But Arabs were very good in optics. I'm never quite clear why, but boy, they were good with optics. They worked out, I forget, his name just flew out of my mind, the Arabic scholar that worked out how the eye works for the first time. Because there's all this debate about how does the human eye work. It's not clear. He worked it out. So optics, medicine, mathematics, this huge leap forward, linguistics, translation, obviously. And it kind of fragments. That golden age, like all golden ages, sort of settles down. It's attacked from the outside. They lose the Iberian Peninsula. The Mongols come in. It's divided from within. But the fragments of that we still live with, and the concepts and the ideas and the cultural heritage, both in our world, the Western world, through the Renaissance, through the Enlightenment, through concepts like deism, and the fact that Aristotle is around is one of the crucial ideas that is influential to us. And in the Islamic world is because of the arguments against it. It was still influential. It still hugely influenced the way they reasoned, by the way. Aristotle basically wrote the book on reasoning, and we all just use it. It's one way to think about it. But they did come up with another answer. They did come up with an original response. Al-Ghazali, not by himself, I'm just using this as a representative. And they also tend to argue, as we're not familiar with, by analogy. Very popular. Direct quote from the Quran and by analogy, comparative analogy. It's a very interesting form of making an argument and making a point. But those differences are deep-seated, but curiously they come from a shared heritage. It's the Greeks again. The acceptance of and the rejection of it. Finally, let me finish up by pointing out that what Al-Ghazali's point gets very much closer to is the Neoplatonist position, which is hilarious, is that they end up taking on the sort of Neoplatonic ideal of this encounter with the metaphysical sort of emanations. It's very confusing when you read it, but it is this idea of sort of the spirit rising up. Maybe the clearest example you can see is in the Phaedrus by Socrates, as again he often makes things clearer than other places, where he says there is this world of the ideal real, and then below that is the world of the gods, and then there's the world that humans inhabit. And what happens is the gods are the gods because they're able to access the ideal world more or less all the time. So that's where they get truth and knowledge and wisdom and everything from, because they live up there and they can see it and touch it and experience it. For humans, what happens is we have our souls, which are immortal, and they go up and they just touch it. They just peek a little bit in there, and then, they get reincarnated, essentially, not the word they would use. They get reincarnated, and we have a memory of that encounter with perfection, which makes us a little bit like the gods. And that the way you achieve true knowledge, reason helps, introspection helps, all that helps, but really it is through re-experiencing your soul's encounter with the absolute truth that's up there someplace. Now you can substitute Allah for the ethereal realm, get rid of the gods in the middle, and you're pretty much on your way. They took a lot of stuff from Plotinus, for instance, to make this argument. And finally, I'm going to mention that this line of argument is not dead. We still live in the West best in, I think, at least two places you can see. Ernst Cassirer, still an influential philosopher, this was central to his idea. He said straightforward in his essay on being human. He says straightforward, look, you can't reason your way to absolute truth, you can only gain it through inspiration. Which is, like I said, more or less quoting Al-Ghazali. I don't know if he meant to quote Al-Ghazali, but I think he did mean to quote Al-Ghazali. And anytime we talk about the arts, anytime we talk about music, anytime we talk about these things that we find uplifting and spiritual, we invoke this notion of there's this super rational, or there's this exterior force, something beyond and greater and mightier and somehow better than we are, that we encounter occasionally, and it moves us powerfully, and we call it this, the force, the spirit, the thing outside, the encounter with the higher world, the ethereal plane, the immortal, the eternal. I felt moved by the real, the universe spoke to me. All this language is precisely the language of Al-Ghazali. This is the argument that he makes. And what we've done culturally is we've divided that out very carefully. And we've said that kind of language is okay to use for some things, but not okay to use for other things. So we haven't really taken the sort of Averroes line as far as we could. And so while there is this huge cultural distinction, keep this in mind, that if you read Al-Ghazali, take the religion out of it and put art or music or hiking or encountering nature, it'll ring much more true to you. It's not as alien as you would think. We aren't as far away as we like to pretend. A lot of it, we're still very close. That cultural heritage, we were together. This line of reasoning, argumentation, and influence was very close for 500 or 600 years. And those sorts of emanations and ties, they don't just vanish. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen. Al-Ghazali and Averroes. Yeah.
Born 1842, lived to 1910. He is honestly our only philosopher. If you read European books in French or German about American philosophy, they begin with William James and they end with William James. Right? One entry. That's only barely an exaggeration. He was our great contribution to philosophy. The good side of it is, his contribution was so astoundingly strong that he really cemented a place for American thinkers in philosophy. And if you read either the Italian or French philosophers in particular, one of the questions they ask is, where are the rest of your William Jameses? Right, that's what they want to know. Much like many of the Continental readers think, where are the rest of your Henry Jameses? They were brothers, of course. Anyway, born into the James family, in which everybody had the same name for generations, by the way. If you try to read a biography of any of these characters, because they only had theirs, William and Henry, and then they named everybody that. And so you'll have like whole scenes where there'll be like 5 or 6 William and Henry Jameses talking to each other or corresponding, and you just never know what the hell's going on. But they were a close family, lots of kids, extended family. His father was what you call him, eccentric. Yeah, he's eccentric. But he did not believe in public education. He thought the public schools just ruined your mind. But it's not clear he knew what he believed in. So he would hire tutors and then fire them. And then he would take over their education himself and realize that wasn't working. So then they'd go to Europe for a while, and he'd put them in European schools. He decided those European schools were bad and moved to another city in Europe, and they put him in schools there. So this way James went to Germany, England and Germany, several cities in Germany while he was quite young, and then to Paris, and then back to America, where they put him in schools and took him out. So they did this his whole life. Into schools, out of schools, private tutors, fire them, get somebody else in, take it over himself, get rid of, decide that's not working. And so he had a broad and strange education. Great with languages, because he was for some time educated in Germany, in German, in France, in French. And this gave him a big help so that he corresponded and wrote and visited a lot in later life with French and German philosophers and researchers. And this aided him greatly in his research, as we'll see. aspect of the family is that they were very, very, what would you call, they're literarily inclined. Henry James, his brother, probably, certainly one of our foremost novelists, greatest novelist of that period, and still one of the foremost novelists in English. They were raised together in this family, and they talked about literature, they talked about science, they talked about philosophy, they talked about religion, more or less what the family did. And all of the correspondence that we have of people who visited the family at the time would leave and say, you simply cannot believe the level of dinner table conversation at the James's house. This is like getting a doctoral dissertation dropping by for dinner. But they're also quite aggressive. This was the other thing, is they would get in there and threaten each other at the dinner table with knives, right? I can't believe you would say that about Helmholtz's research. They went at it, hammer and tongs, as they say. Very, very lively, aggressive. It wasn't a dour, repressed family like that. No, they were alive, and their letters are quite crazy. Where, William James would write to Henry James something like, just read your latest novel, blew my head off, ran around the streets naked, screaming to the neighbors that my brother is the greatest writer who ever lived, and I'll kill you if you say otherwise. Your brother in love, William James. Right? I mean, that would be all dash, right? And so they had this sort of crazy, lively streaks. There wasn't all seriousness and dourness. But for William, this led to a bit of a crisis. He was always quite gifted, very, very successful education-wise, knew he was smart, knew he had skills, didn't have any idea what to do with them. And this became increasingly a problem because Henry was about 18 months younger than he was and launched a literary career very young. And so James, the older brother, the leader, very intellectually gifted, continually starts hearing, well, okay, I'm 22, my younger brother's 19 and a half, he's starting to publish reviews. Well, that's very nice. Well, I'm 24, he's starting to publish novels and get a reputation, and I'm doing, well, good for Henry. I'm 26. Henry is now more or less an independent person living off the earnings and royalties, becoming quite the reputation in Europe, and I am, I'm 28. And he had this problem. He did not know what to do. He was good at just about whatever he turned his hand to, and he was always active. But he couldn't figure out what he should actually do. His first great decision was to be a painter, and they had a family friend who was an excellent painter, and so he said, well, I'm going to move in with this guy and learn to paint. And his father was dead set against this. And not for the reason that I think any other father has ever been dead set against their son becoming a professional artist. He didn't say, well, you're not going to be able to make a living, because he didn't care about that. He didn't say, well, you won't be a great painter, because he thought maybe his son would be a great painter. What he said was, you will not find the diverse intellectual fulfillment that you need if you become a painter. That is not who you are. You're not a painter. You will be intellectually starved. So you need to do something that will be more intellectually fulfilling for you. And this turns out to be true. And it took, even though he was a beautiful sketch artist, and everyone commented on this immediately, he realized, as he wrote to Henry James, I believe, he said, there's nothing more depressing in the world than a second-rate artist. And so he was not going to do that. He said, I'm not going to be a second-rate artist. So then he goes to Harvard. And what do you study at Harvard? Well, you study everything. He just started wandering around. And this is when Harvard was not particularly well organized. If you could pay the tuition, you were in. You did not necessarily need to attend classes. There was no formal structure for a lot of the materials that was being presented. The professors that were there had been chosen in a very haphazard, almost random fashion, many of whom wanted nothing to do with students. And so, as a writer, a contemporary said, Harvard likes to take credit for all of the brilliant people like William James who have graduated from there, but I'm not sure you get to take credit for them surviving your institution. And that's what he always thought of it as, is yes, well, they survived it. Yeah. So James immediately, or eventually decides that he's going to go into medicine. And he decides on this because, one, he's been interested in physiological research for quite some time. He's done dissection. He's been in laboratories. But mostly because it's a job. He goes into it for the cash, almost purely. He's like, well, I don't know what else to do, and if I'm a doctor, at least that's something I can do to make money while I figure out what I want to do. Great. So he goes in to be a doctor. So he's in studying to be a doctor, which I don't even want to tell you what the medical field was like then. It's just not terribly rigorous, let me put it that way. When you graduate, you had to take a series of 9 tests in each subject. Each test was about 30 minutes long, and you had to pass 4 of them. So you could fail things like, the nervous system and surgery and gynecology and birth. It'd still be okay and still get your doctor's, right? Oh, terrifying stuff. So he's in his first year of medical school, and he gets an offer from another professor. He says, look, you've always been interested in natural philosophy. I'm going to go up to Brazil and collect specimens. Why don't you come with me? And James just leaps at the opportunity. Absolutely. Bored out of his mind with the medical stuff. Let's go to Brazil. I'll be a naturalist, he